Welcome! Today we are getting right into one of the biggest questions in psychology, and this is a massive one for you AQA A-level psychology students. Are criminals born or are they made? We're going to unpack the biological side of this huge debate, making sure we hit every single assessment objective you need for those exams.
Right, this question, it's the classic nature versus nurture debate, and it sits at the absolute core of forensic psychology. Does our DNA write our destiny before we've even started, or is it the world we grow up in that shapes us? In this explainer, we're diving headfirst into that nature argument, the biological evidence behind offending.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll build a solid foundation with the core AO1 knowledge on genes and brains. Then we're going to look at AO2, applying these ideas to the real world. After that, it's the big one, a full-on AO3 evaluation, weighing up all the strengths and weaknesses before we pull everything together for a final verdict. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's kick off with Section 1. This is your essential AO1 knowledge dump. We're talking about the fundamental theories and studies you just have to know for your exam. And we're going to start with the building blocks themselves, our genes.
So, first things first, let's get one thing straight. There is no single criminal gene. That's just not how it works. The modern view is that any genetic link to offending behavior is polygenic. What does that mean? Well, it means that hundreds, maybe even thousands of different genes all chip in, each contributing just a tiny little piece to create a potential vulnerability.
So, you might be wondering, how on earth do we test for a genetic link like that? Well, the classic way is the twin study. You can almost think of it as a natural experiment. We compare identical or monozygotic twins who share 100% of their genes with non-identical or dizygotic twins who only share about 50%. This comparison lets us start to untangle what's down to genes and what's down to the environment.
And that leads us to a key piece of research from Christensen. What he found was that if one identical twin had a criminal conviction, the other twin was way more likely to have one too, much more so than for non-identical twins. This higher concordance rate, as it's called, in MZ twins is a pretty big clue that there's a genetic component at play. But, and this is super important, it's never 100%. That tells us genes can't be the whole story.
And the evidence doesn't stop there. Adoption studies, like the one by Crow, are really useful because they help separate genes from the environment. And guess what? They found that adoptees with a biological mother who had a criminal record were more likely to offend themselves. And more recently, science has gotten even more specific, zooming in on what are called candidate genes. The most famous of these is the MAOA gene, often called the warrior gene, which plays a role in regulating key chemicals in our brain.
Now this slide is basically a revision goldmine. Look at how it lays everything out. It's a perfect example of how to use the grave criteria for your evaluation points. So for Christensen, you can talk about reliability. His findings have been backed up. But then you critique its validity because, can you ever really separate out the shared environment for twins? And with Bruner's study, it's a fascinating case, but its generalizability is pretty low because that family was one of a kind.
Okay, so we've talked about the genetic blueprint. Now let's look at the hardware that blueprint builds, the brain itself. This is the second half of your core AO1 knowledge, the neural explanations.
The part of the brain we're really interested in here is the prefrontal cortex. Think of it as the brain's CEO. It's in charge of things like moral reasoning and, crucially, reining in our impulses. Now, the landmark study here is from Rainey and his team. They used PET scans and found that murderers who were pleading not guilty by reason of insanity had way less activity going on in this region. It's like the part of the brain that says, hey, maybe don't do that, just wasn't working properly. Right, so this is really, really important. Modern biological explanations are not saying your genes make you a criminal. That's way too simple. Instead, they use what's called the diathesis stress model. The idea is that your biology, whether it's the MAOA gene or a less active prefrontal cortex, creates the diathesis. That's the vulnerability. But it often takes a stress, like a difficult or traumatic childhood, to actually pull the trigger and lead to offending.
Okay, let's switch gears. We've got the knowledge, now we need to use it. We're moving on to AO2, application. This is where you really start to shine, by showing that you can take all that theory and apply it to real-world situations and make those smart links across different topics.
And this timeline just shows it perfectly. Imagine this scenario. You've got someone with a totally clean record, a stable life. Then they have a serious accident and suffer a traumatic brain injury right in their prefrontal cortex. After the accident, their whole personality changes. They become impulsive, irritable, and aggressive, and they end up committing a violent crime.
This is a powerful, real-world example for your AO2, showing how neural factors can sometimes be a very direct cause.
And here is a pro tip for boosting your grade. That diathesis stress model we just talked about? It's not just for forensics. It's the exact same idea you use in the psychopathology topic to explain things like OCD or depression. A genetic vulnerability gets triggered by a life event. If you can make that link in your essay, you're showing the examiner that you really get the bigger picture, and they love that.
All right, we've arrived at the part that really separates the good essays from the great ones. AO3 evaluation. It's time to play judge and jury, to put these biological explanations on trial and properly weigh up all the evidence, for and against.
So, we're going to structure our debate around these key points. On one side of the courtroom, we have the strengths, its scientific approach, and its practical uses. And on the other side, we have some major limitations to consider, like the kind of evidence we're looking at and some really deep ethical questions. So what's in the pros column? Well, a huge strength is that we have converging evidence. That just means we have lots of different types of research. Twin studies, adoption studies, brain scans, all kind of pointing in the same direction. That gives the whole theory a lot of scientific credibility. And it has potential real-world uses, maybe helping us spot at-risk kids who could benefit from early support.
But, and it's a big but, the limitations are pretty serious. Most of the evidence is just correlational. And we've already touched on the methodological issues with things like twin studies. But honestly, the biggest problems are philosophical. These explanations can be very reductionist, boiling complex human behavior down to just biology and ignoring social factors. And they can be deterministic, which gets us into some very tricky territory around free will.
This right here is an absolutely critical point for your evaluation. It's the classic chicken and egg problem. Does having less activity in your prefrontal cortex cause you to become violent? Or could a life of violence, maybe with drug abuse and high stress, actually cause changes in your brain? The truth is, the research we have right now can't definitively tell us which way the arrow points. And that leads us to maybe the deepest, thorniest question of all. If someone's genes and their brain structure make them heavily predisposed to violence, how much free will do they really have? And if their free will is compromised, how should our justice system deal with that? I mean, where does responsibility lie? There are no easy answers here, that's for sure.
So, we've heard the arguments from both sides. Where do we land? What's the final verdict? Let's pull all of this together now and craft a smart, balanced conclusion that's going to get you top marks.
Really, the only sensible conclusion here is an interactionist one. Biology is not destiny. It just isn't. Instead, you can think of it like this. Your genes and your brain might deal you a certain hand of cards. That's your predisposition. But whether that hand ever leads to actual offending behavior depends on a whole complex cocktail of other things. Your environment, your upbringing, your psychology.
And if you remember nothing else, remember this sentence. This is your key takeaway for any top-grade essay. You have to conclude that while biological factors are a crucial piece of the puzzle, they are simply incomplete on their own. They have to be considered alongside other approaches, like social learning theory or cognitive ideas, to get anywhere close to the full picture.
And we'll end with this thought to leave you with. If we accept that biology isn't destiny, if we know that certain biological factors create a risk and that certain environments can flip that switch, then what is our responsibility as a society? Does it change how we think about preventing crime, about rehabilitation, or even about what justice really means? It's a lot to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.